Welcome, everybody, to Nights at the Movies, a film podcast with me, Professor Paul Miller, and one of my favorite co-hosts, Leslie Heimbaugh. Leslie, welcome back to our podcast.
Hello. I'm glad to be here.
So far, we have done 4 episodes to this point. We've had a very nice reception to some of our fans out there, so we appreciate that. We're going to continue doing once a month. We're going to do it till at least the end of the year, and then once Leslie graduates, we may edit our schedule a little bit. But we're going to be coming here to you for the next several months, once a month, to go over and talk about one of our favorite subjects, and that's the film industry. During our last podcast, we took the time to discuss and break down the films of Christopher Nolan. And as I edited that podcast, Leslie, one of the things that still continued to strike me was where his movies ranked in the IMDb Top 100. So we're going to be doing that again today, while also talking about the budgets of these films and how they did at the box office. So that's what we're going to do. And this time, we are going to talk about Again, it's now like a 2-horse race between Christopher Nolan and Quentin Tarantino, but we are going to talk about the films of Tarantino, and we're going to rank those films based on our personal, how much we like them. So that's our goal for today. Leslie, before we get started, how did you first get introduced to Tarantino?
I was on a trip to Washington, D.C., and it was for work, and they put us up in a beautiful hotel, and it had the pay-per-view movies, and I watched Pulp Fiction. It was the first time I'd ever seen a Tarantino movie. My husband and I could not get over just about every detail about the movie. The fact that we were laughing about horrible violence was just crazy, and then the story being told out of order was so fascinating. The beginning was really the end of the movie, but the way it was done was just so compelling, and it just you weren't bored for a minute. Because my husband is not a movie buff, and he would start snickering, and then he's like, "Oh, I can't believe I'm laughing at Leon getting shot in the face." I think his name was Leon, but anyway, that's where my first one was, and I was hooked right from that point.
I kind of got into it a little bit differently. So when Pulp Fiction came out, I believe I was 14 or 15, and of course I did share with you that I did end up sneaking into the movie during that time. One of the things, though, is even at that age, I definitely respected it, but it didn't necessarily resonate with me because I was still new to movies. Even so, I was like, this is crazy. This is so out of the ordinary. This is different. And honestly, what it did was kind of propelled me into taking more of a deeper interest in film. The interesting thing about Pulp Fiction is obviously when it came out on VHS at that point, I had that. I probably seen it. I couldn't even count how many times. More than enough. Probably 50, which is a lot to see a movie.
I have seen it that many times also.
It was Jackie Brown that actually at that point, it was just like, this is a movie. I've never heard of this Tarantino guy. This is a great movie, but because I liked that movie so much, and then I started following his career. Yeah. And basically the next, probably all the way up until Hateful Eight, I saw every movie in the theater. I saw Jackie Brown, Kill Bill, and often right when they came out. Death Proof, which we'll talk about, I actually saw the double feature in the theater with Robert Rodriguez as part of the Grindhouse, which is really cool. I saw Inglourious Bastards and Django in the theater, and Hateful Eight was the one I didn't get to see. And I also didn't get to see Once Upon a Time in the theater either, which kind of bothered me. But unfortunately, I probably only get to the movies maybe 4 or 5 times a year if I'm lucky.
I see most things on my TV at home.
Well, I'm committed to changing that after not being able to see films for so long because of COVID. I'm definitely going to make an effort to see some more movies in the theater. So, but it was Jackie Brown, and I'll never forget, for whatever reason, I'm not sure the marketing decision here, but Jackie Brown came out on Christmas Day, and I remember I was in high school, and one of my friends did not celebrate Christmas, so he was free that day, and we ended up going to see it, and have been a Tarantino fan ever since.
That's a great movie.
What's interesting is with him, with Quentin Tarantino, obviously Once Upon a Time came out 2019, but prior to that, it had been since 2015 since Hateful Eight came out. I think that's what's, and why things have changed a little bit more for me, because Tarantino is one of these types of people who... It's 3 and 4 years that now, and I understand now why.
Exactly.
He's writing the script. He's so hands-on in every single aspect of it. So I get, especially with Once Upon a Time, the amount of production that went into that film. One of the things that I really appreciate is the amount of time and care. But then by that rationale, he's only done 9 full-length films that we credit him for. So we are going to talk about the following films, and we'll be in this order. Reservoir Dogs, Pulp Fiction, Jackie Brown. We're going to combine Kill Bill Volumes 1 and 2 for the purposes of this podcast. Death Proof, Inglourious Bastards, Django Unchained, The Hateful Eight, and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Of course, several other films that he was highly invested in. He had a directing credit in 4 Rooms. He wrote and starred in From Dusk Till Dawn, which is another sort of guilty pleasure for me, I suppose, sort of flashing forward to our next episode. But those are the main ones. Of course, he wrote Natural Born Killers and True Romance, which I also appreciate for what they are, but they have his influence, but they're not Tarantino films.
Right.
So those are the 9 we're going to talk about here today with you. And we're going to go in chronological order. So we're going to rank them. We're going to talk about budget and box office for each. Okay. So we are going to start with Reservoir Dogs. Reservoir Dogs came out in 1991. I was a ripe old age of 10 years old. So this film was not on my radar. And in fact, I came back to it later down the road. For Reservoir Dogs, so Quentin Tarantino famously worked in a video store, was a huge film buff, had done some things independently, but really was just putting together a bunch of his friends and being able to, in the early days of independent cinema, putting something together based on some of his scripts. And what's interesting is, with Reservoir Dogs, a budget of $1.2 million, which actually was even higher than what Christopher Nolan did with his first film.
Right.
Opening weekend in U.S. and Canada, $147,000, and a total gross worldwide of only $2.9 million. But it wasn't just the film itself. It was sort of the cult following that happened with it. And I think a lot of it came after Pulp Fiction.
Exactly. People went back to find it.
And I did.
I did too.
So when you look at the film and you look at the box office, obviously the film itself, I'm just going to spoil it, my personal favorite film of Quentin Tarantino's.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's funny because I like its grittiness. I like the story is great, the memorable lines. It's, again, one of those films that I watched in my late teenage years that really got me, and now, this is what film can be. So tell me a little bit more about your impression of Reservoir Dogs.
Well, yeah, the grittiness is the first thing you think of. And now you're making me really want to go back and revisit it because I haven't seen it in a long time. I know I loved it. And, after seeing Pulp Fiction first and then going back to it, I loved how he used virtually the same cast in almost all the movies, and with notable exceptions. But the way that he finds a little different spin on a certain character that person plays, and they have varying degrees of involvement in the films. But I loved the movie, and again, the violence and everything. It's very you're kind of living vicariously through people because you would never do the things they do in those movies, but you can see why it's so satisfying to watch.
Well, I mean, it's certainly worth noting that with not only Reservoir Dogs, Pulp Fiction, and basically every movie that Tarantino has, he does have a crew of people that he has in many of his films. Tim Roth, Steve Buscemi.
Yeah.
And the list goes on. Madsen's been in several of his films. Obviously, Travolta's been in a couple films.
Yeah.
Samuel L. Jackson, of course. So he does, and that's part of his auteur nature.
Yes.
Imagine Samuel L. Jackson being in Reservoir Dogs.
Oh, my God.
That's a funny one. So in terms of user ratings here on IMDb, which is what we are using, comes in at an 8.3. So not like with Chris Nolan, most of his films ended up somewhere in the top 100. An 8.3 is still a really solid score. And in fact, Reservoir Dogs comes in on IMDb as the number 90 movie. So definitely one that's very well respected, very loved. There's not really a whole heck of a lot you can say about this film. Really, the only negative in any of the things that I've read about it is the violence. And to be honest with you, that can be said for almost every single one of his films. And we don't necessarily have to get into that. One of the things that I thought Once Upon a Time was great is there wasn't much violence. The violence that was there was
horrific.
Was strange and odd.
But you did find yourself saying, when's this going to happen? It seems like we're missing something here.
Well, interestingly enough, I took my wife to see Django, and she enjoyed very much the first 2 hours of the movie, and then of course at the end of Django it's a total bloodbath. And so that was like, she was with it all the way up to that point, but after that, kind of turned her off a little bit. That's what I liked about Once Upon a Time, is that it was a little more approachable for the average person to watch. And again, that is one of the reasons and one of the main critiques of Tarantino is the way that he uses violence. And I think that it's worth noting that maybe that's part of the reason that he has broken through to the mainstream. I mean, there's no question about that.
No question.
But the fact that he hasn't made that next leap, because his movies just aren't for everyone.
No, they are not.
And it takes a special kind of person, not even intellectually necessarily, but to appreciate these kinds of movies. So a very, very low budget, a very, very low take, but Reservoir Dogs has sort of been propped up after all these years because of the Pulp Fiction, which 2 years later, Leslie, Reservoir Dogs came out in 1992, Pulp Fiction in 94. I do remember Pulp Fiction came out late in the year, and I think much of its box office came in 95 because I was about 14 years old at that time. So Pulp Fiction really kind of helped prop up Reservoir Dogs. But again, thinking back to Reservoir Dogs and why it resonates with me as my favorite, it's because there's I don't even call it action. The scenes move quickly, which is something that, frankly, with Tarantino movies, certainly in his later films, they drag. It's his shortest work outside of Death Proof, which was meant to be sort of a double feature type film. So other than that, it's his shortest film that he directed. I think it was very much more to the point, and there was never ending plot twists and action, things like that. And I just love it. It's one I can sit down and I don't have to think too much about. Not that really any of his movies are necessarily, but some of the other ones do drag at certain spots.
I don't mind the drag in them because there's so much sort of character building that's happening during those times that are calm. Like, you're getting sort of the behind the scenes of what's happening. And because he tells stories, not in the traditional, order, I think you have to even do a little more work to prepare people for why something is happening.
Well, I think what's really interesting to that, to your point, it's a concept called nonlinear editing.
Yes.
And this also goes to Tarantino's auteur nature.
Yes.
That even in his newest film, Once Upon a Time, there were flashbacks, flash forwards. It was not told in one linear way. And honestly, what's interesting about Tarantino is he paved the way for a new way of narrative storytelling in film. It's rare you see a film that's told from beginning to end without a great deal. And we talked about this with Chris Nolan, too, about a great deal of flashbacks, flash forwards, or even time sort of jumping forward and backward. And I think a lot of this came from Tarantino, which I find very interesting, and one of the reasons that I feel that he is, so highly regarded in film. So where does Reservoir Dogs come in for you, Leslie?
Don't be sad, but I have it at number 8. But again, I need to revisit it. It would probably change if I saw it right now.
I think that I'm certainly not going to give you a hard time on that. But what I will say is that I do think and hope, if nothing else, that you're taking away from this is please give it another shot if it's been a while since you've watched it. And it's also one of those movies that holds up for being early 90s. We're talking almost well, it is 30 years old.
Yes.
You'd watch it and you wouldn't, maybe because the HD wasn't quite there yet.
Right.
But you don't think of that movie as being 30 years
Yeah.
old when you see it.
Once I get into a movie, that kind of stuff sort of goes out for me. I mean, I don't care about that as much.
So Leslie's got Reservoir Dogs coming in at 8. I have it at number 1. So we disagree a little bit, but still enjoy the movie very much. All right, next up is going to be 1994's Pulp Fiction. This was really his breakthrough film. I mean, I don't think there's any way around that. So the movie was made for $8 million.
Right.
That, to me, I guess I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I mean, I knew most of his films, certainly his first like 4 films, were fairly low budget, but $8 million for the amount of stars that they had in that movie is absolutely shocking.
Yeah.
When you think about, now again, Travolta hadn't done anything since Look Who's Talking.
Yeah, and that was not what you expected from him.
And
so this movie did a lot of jobs. You know what I mean? It had a lot of roles to fill, and Travolta came back blazing, I thought.
Absolutely. And Samuel L. Jackson was still, I don't know that he was an A-lister at the time, but he was well known.
Yeah.
You have people like Harvey Keitel, who was, coming off of Reservoir Dogs 2. So again, not an A-lister, but Uma Thurman kind of introduced on the scene. And of course, Bruce Willis, who was by far the biggest star. I mean, I guess you could argue Travolta, but in terms of when that movie was made, Willis was still, I would consider, an A-lister, whereas Travolta was probably like a C-lister at that point.
But and Bruce Willis had, he was kind of typecast, I think. I mean, he had some different things that he did, but this movie he got to really show his depth, I thought.
Well, what's interesting is on the surface that coming off of Die Hard and some of the other films that he had done, on the surface, when you're looking at that, he's almost playing that same type of white T-shirt wearing tough guy.
Right, but like with just this added dimension that you don't get from, at least that's how I read it.
100%, and I totally agree with you. I think that's what's really interesting about this is because when you're just looking at the film and you're watching a trailer, you're like, okay, that's Bruce Willis from Die Hard.
Yeah.
But that definitely was not what happened.
Yeah.
One thing I do remember, and I've read a lot about this movie, which is why it shocks me that to me that budget seems so low.
Yeah.
The biggest expense in the whole film was the Jackrabbit Slim's restaurant facade. And because that was, that wasn't a restaurant, a real restaurant. They made it.
Yeah.
And those cars I remember hearing that just that set alone was millions of dollars.
Wow.
So when you think about the amount of money that these people were paid to do this film, it's really quite incredible. Opening weekend of only $9 million. So I wonder what happened. It seemed to hang around for a long while, and it got a ton of Oscar buzz, and a gross in the U.S. of Canada of over $100 million, and a worldwide gross of over $200 million on an $8 million budget. Pretty
unbelievable. But the word of mouth was just berserk on this. If you hadn't seen it around the water cooler, at least at work where I worked, you were really behind the times.
One of the things you can also say, certainly from in terms of Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction, and to a certain point, most of his films, Tarantino, the soundtrack makes the films. And I really believe Reservoir Dogs, I still have that soundtrack. I play it all the time. Same with Pulp Fiction, I have both of them. Yeah. I think that really added a different dimension too.
Absolutely.
And really helped bring you into not even time period, because they're all 90s films listening to 60s and 70s music.
Yeah.
But it allowed for additional depth to those characters.
Yeah.
And I found that the musical elements, especially of these two films, and that's why I think they resonate so much.
Yeah. The theme song from the essential theme song from Pulp Fiction, actually, I wish I could think of the genre of that music with the guitar and the thick guitar strings, like they call them cables practically, and it kills your hands to do that. But that gave a rebirth to that type of music again, because I remember so many shows profiling people that played that kind of guitar, and it stopped you in your tracks. Every time I hear it when that movie comes on now, I can't not look at it, And I think that's another very interesting thing. You want to talk about a movie that holds up. Yeah.
I mean, because it was filmed with better cameras and things like that, you watch it today, you don't even blink an eye that it's Leslie, 27 years old.
Well, and on the music too. The other thing that I love about that soundtrack are the sound bites from the movie.
Yes, and Reservoir Dogs does the same thing.
The bacon talk. What are you Jewish or something? When he says no, I just don't dig on swine. I love that.
Here's what bothers me the most. That after all of these years, Quentin Tarantino has never won, and we can certainly talk about this as we continue to go on, has never won Best Director.
Right.
I was sick
Yeah.
in 2019 that he didn't win for Once Upon a Time.
Me too.
And off the top of my head, I don't have who did win, and I don't want to get into a debate about that. But when you're talking about somebody who has this type of cachet, will clearly go into the Cinema Hall of Fame at some point.
Right.
And the fact that he's never won Best Director, it's sort of a slap in the face. Now, they did win, and I say they, because Quentin Tarantino and Roger Avary both received a Best Writing for their screenplay of Pulp Fiction. And for those of you who don't know about the background, Roger Avary actually wrote the Gold Watch portion of it. So that's Bruce Willis's portion of the film. And then Tarantino wrote the rest. So... And it's really interesting. I actually, when Once Upon a Time came out, there was a new book out about Tarantino that I'd purchased, and I read a lot about this movie. And basically after that, the two never were really friends again after that, because there was because of the mega superstardom that came along with this film. And Tarantino basically went on to have a wonderful career. Roger Avary... who's even really heard of him? I will say, this is just as an aside, one of my all-time favorite films was directed by Roger Avary, and it's named The Rules of Attraction with James Van Der Beek. And I'm sure that when James Van Der Beek,
no.
Honestly, you want to talk about a movie that I think that you would really, really, really like.
Yeah, I've seen it.
Oh, you have?
Yeah.
I love it. I will never... I actually just watched it fairly recently.
Yeah.
But Roger Avary directed that. Probably the most high-profile film that he's been involved with ever since Pulp Fiction.
Yeah, wow.
So,
that's awesome.
Interesting piece about that. Yeah. Before we move off of Pulp Fiction, the all-time #8 film on IMDb. So definitely, worth noting, and certainly Quentin Tarantino's highest effort. So it comes in just after. So the top 10, basically: Shawshank Redemption, Godfather, Godfather 2, Dark Knight, 12 Angry Men, Schindler's List, Lord of the Rings, Pulp Fiction, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Rings. Return of the King was number 7. So lots of Lord of the Rings homers here.
Yeah.
Followed by Fight Club, Forrest Gump, and Inception.
Yeah,
for those keeping score at home. So Pulp Fiction comes in for me at number 2. How about you?
It's number 1 for me. If you remember back to my all-time favorite movies, it's number 1 on that list.
I was going to say,
changed my life.
Astute listeners would already have known the answers to that question. So.
Yeah.
All right, next up, we are going to go to Jackie Brown. Interestingly enough, this is the first time that Tarantino did not do an original screenplay. Now, of course, he did adapt. So there's a little different, for those of you who are film cinephiles, you already are aware of this, but there's a big difference between an original and an adapted screenplay. An original screenplay comes from an original idea, whereas an adapted screenplay is often adapted from something like a book. Now, this might interest you. My favorite author of all time is Elmore Leonard.
Yes.
Elmore Leonard is the person who wrote a book called Rum Punch, which is what the film Jackie Brown was adapted from.
Good to know.
He also, Elmore Leonard, wrote Get Shorty, which is one of my faves also, and Be Cool, which is the sequel. Elmore Leonard also wrote several other films that Tarantino was actually going to adapt additional films from Elmore Leonard. Big Elmore Leonard fan.
Yes.
So this was not an original screenplay, but came from the book Rum Punch.
Yeah.
Very, very similar. There are a couple of different areas where it veers off from the book, but it's pretty true to the spirit.
Yeah.
One of the things that Tarantino is known for is sort of resurrecting people's careers.
Yes.
And the person in this particular film was Pam Grier.
Pam Grier.
Ironically enough, after this, she never really had her sort of moment in the sun.
Right.
Travolta obviously resurrected his career
Sure.
in major ways, and not as active anymore, but again, you're talking 27 years ago. But for about a decade, Travolta was the person in Hollywood.
Yeah.
Pam Grier never really had that opportunity.
Right.
She's wonderful in this movie, though.
Oh my gosh! And who was her love interest in the movie? Played by
Robert Forster.
That's it. He also got a little boost,
Yes,
as well, and plays the most charming, not to be pushed around, but charming character. And his love for her was just, to me, just a beautiful thing.
What's really interesting, too, in this particular film is the number of people, A-listers, in this film. Of course, Robert Forster has had a storied career in Hollywood.
Yeah.
But you have Samuel L. Jackson, Bridget Fonda, the one and only Robert De Niro, Michael Keaton, Chris Tucker. I mean, you've got a really, really good cast here. Here's another really big surprise. Even after Pulp Fiction, Leslie, the budget was only $12 million for Jackie Brown. Now, Tarantino's movies don't have, certainly his early movies, didn't have a lot of blowing things up and a lot of special and visual effects, so that does save your money. But gosh, after coming off of a massive, massive hit with Pulp Fiction, his next movie is only a $12 million budget?
But, probably resurrecting those stars really has to save you because...
Sure. You're not paying... That's probably the biggest payout.
And it's such an interesting way to get them back in the limelight. Bridget Fonda, she had done bigger movies herself, but to play that character she played in, so good. And Robert De Niro as a basically a boob. You know, like somebody
so out of the
clueless.
ordinary for De Niro.
He did it beautifully.
So Jackie Brown, I guess I've never taken the time, Leslie, to go through some of these grosses. Only $39 million brought in. I mean, again, they're still making 3 times their money.
Yeah.
I'm sure no one was really upset about that. But only $39 million gross. Here's what's really interesting. In terms of, and again, we're just going off IMDb here. It doesn't seem like there was any worldwide box office for this. The U.S., basically, it's looking like $500 difference between the U.S. and Canada gross versus the worldwide gross. So I'm not sure if that's just an incorrect thing or if they just didn't send it overseas. You also got to realize that up until probably about 20 years ago, there was not that kind of traction overseas for American movies like with Pulp Fiction. Pulp Fiction was big overseas, but it's really been a more modern thing that there's the box office numbers for these films are much larger, like with Chris Nolan.
And the soundtrack from Jackie Brown I have also, and it really made so many of my friends aware of the gorgeous R&B, just beautiful, deep, emotional. Just the way that Pam Grier's, the way that she inspires, him to go to the record store and buy that cassette. You just can't beat that soundtrack either.
And interestingly enough, this is definitely a situation where the main character, not to say Tarantino does use some essence of film noir in that almost all of his films have an anti-hero. So your lead character are people who typically could be potentially villains. I mean, in Reservoir Dogs, you've got a bunch of thieves. In Pulp Fiction, your heroes, if you will, are assassins.
And you root for them constantly.
And even in Jackie Brown, she is basically smuggling money through the airlines. And so even though she is a criminal, she still has some redeeming qualities.
Oh my gosh, so much heart. And she wants out.
Yes.
She wants out.
So for Jackie Brown, a 7.5 rating, that's going to come in at 585 all time. I mean, even so, anybody would be happy with a 580. Of all the films in film history, you're in the top 600. I think almost anyone would be happy with that. What's interesting here is this, I think, really, I hate to say this, but sort of put Tarantino in his place. I think this was a major situation where his ego took a massive hit. Because he came off of this massive film and he came out with Jackie Brown and it just didn't really do it. What's interesting here is that, and I'm not sure if you knew this, he took a 6-year hiatus.
I didn't realize that.
Because 97 was Jackie Brown. Kill Bill did not come out till 2003. Now, in the time between Pulp Fiction, you've got him writing Natural Born Killers, directing a segment of Four Rooms, being involved with From Dusk Till Dawn, and then Jackie Brown. It seemed that whirlwind of those 3 years and then maybe a poor showing with Jackie Brown really kind of reset him.
Yeah.
And again, 6 years. And in fact, there's nothing on his IMDb resume between 1997 and 2003.
Wow.
So that's a pretty big gap. In his defense, I do know that because they filmed Kill Bill, both sections of it, it was originally intended to be one movie. I'm not sure if you knew that. As we move on,
that would have been one long movie,
and that's why they made it into two. And they filmed that all at the same time.
Yeah.
So one came out in 2003, one in 2004, and so the production of that film probably took 2 or 3 times longer than any other film.
Yeah.
So that certainly contributed to that 6-year hiatus. But I've always wondered what impact that Jackie Brown's kind of poor showing had.
Yeah, that's a really good
him.
point. I think, and it many of his movies, actually, the cult following is probably higher numbers of people, involves higher numbers of people than, the first box office.
So the next one I want to move on to is, like I said, we're going to talk about Kill Bill Volume 1 and Volume 2. Volume 1, it's kind of 6 and 1/2 dozen the other. Volume 1 an 8.1, Volume 2 an 8.0.
Mm-hmm.
That's good enough for 352 for Volume 2, and so that's good enough for 118 for Volume 1, 118 overall, and 352. I actually prefer the second one myself in isolation, comparing the two.
I do too, but what I loved about what he did, Volume 1 left you. Actually, the truth is, I saw Volume 2 first.
Oh, wow.
And then I saw Volume 1. But what I love about this is the two movies, they still stand alone perfectly well. You don't, it's great because it fills in a lot of gaps, but they're not gaps you can't live with, between the two.
One of the things, and this is honestly, and I think this is the good time to take it because we're right at about the halfway point here. One of the reason I want to bring this up right now, and this is something I was thinking a lot about because over the last month or so, Leslie, I've really been thinking a lot about Tarantino versus Christopher Nolan, and if somebody would ask me who my favorite director is, what I would say. Because up until about 3 years ago, I would have said Tarantino.
Yeah.
And I still probably would say Tarantino.
Yeah.
The reason is Christopher Nolan, most all of his films are a similar genre.
Yeah.
Right? We would call them thrillers. Now, certainly he did have a war movie, which Tarantino has been rumored for years to want to do, but he's also been rumored somehow, and I'm glad I didn't see it on his IMDb page, to be involved in another Star Trek production. So I don't know that I would see that. Here's what I like about Tarantino. When you look down at all these different films, they're all different. Like, they're not like, not to say that Christopher Nolan's films aren't different, right? But for one, he had 3 Batmans in there.
Right.
Yes, Tarantino had 2 Kill Bills.
Yeah.
I'll give him that. But you've got a karate movie here. You've got like a 60s type of movie. You've got a buddy, not even a buddy cop, but like a cops and robbers type of movie. You've got a Western. You've got Inglourious Bastards is wartime. I don't know that I consider that a war movie per se, but you certainly could make that case. So he is trying to do different things with his films. He's got some original screenplays. He's got some adapted screenplays. I think that's why I care so much more than about Tarantino than Nolan.
Yeah, I think Christopher Nolan's a genius, but it's not even a contest for me. I'm all Tarantino.
Well, let's go to I'm with this particular movie. I'm not entirely sure how they did the budgets because it was supposed to be one. But for Kill Bill, $30 million budget, $22 million opening weekend U.S. and Canada, a U.S. gross of 70, and a 180 worldwide gross. So this, by all intents and purposes, was probably outside of Pulp Fiction his most successful movie to this point.
Yes.
But still, even in the U.S. gross of only $70 million, that kind of seems low to me.
Does.
As much as it got a lot of fanfare at the time. This movie of all of them, I truly believe is the one that's the most visually appealing.
It's very visually appealing, and the colors, and it's everything. I've seen this one way too many times too. It's on the movie channels all the time, and you catch snippets of it, and then you end up seeing yourself watching the next one, which is the other part that wasn't on. But yeah, plus I think it's great that he involved so many different. You could tell the heroes of his movie direction. A lot of the older kind of Asian. It's a nod to all those kind of kung fu or karate movies and things like that, but it's so beautifully done because you've seen other ones that are really hacks. This is not that at all.
Some old Jackie Chan movies.
Yeah.
Here's one of the interesting things I just wanted to, but before I get to this point, on Kill Bill 2, again, a budget of $30 million. So I'm assuming that maybe the overall budget was 60 and they just chopped that in half, or for all I know, it could be that it was 30 for both.
Yeah.
$66 million in the U.S., 150. So for both of them, you're looking at well over 130 million in the U.S. and well over 300 million for worldwide. So here's the thing before we move off of Kill Bill that I want to bring up. Here's another thing that I think really endeared Tarantino to a lot of people. Honestly, Reservoir Dogs, no strong female characters. None. In fact, I can't even think outside of the teacher that was shot by one of the Mr. Orange. I don't even recall a female in the movie.
Right.
But when you look at the strength of Uma Thurman's character in Pulp Fiction, and then you look at Pam Grier and Jackie Brown, and then you look at Uma Thurman in Kill Bill, you're talking about putting female lead characters as like these butt-kicking, like super strong women. And I think that that's definitely something that you can admit that in his last few films he's gotten away from.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think that this is one of the things that really put him on the map because he was doing something different,
That's right. And to be a hero the way she was a hero, because every single person she was against before they died, they all acknowledged she didn't deserve to die that way. That they thought she was dead, and that scene where I don't think it's a spoiler at this point.
Well, we're not spoiling 20-year-old movies here.
But where she claws her way out of a coffin that is 6 feet underground, that is probably one of the single most upsetting moments, cinema moments of my life. I hyperventilated the first several times I saw it because I just couldn't believe how imagining waking, being in a coffin and only having a flashlight. Luckily she had, a knife to cut herself loose, but just the most upsetting image for me.
And as I think back, probably one of the most memorable scenes in his entire catalog.
Yeah.
All right, next up comes Death Proof. Now, I want to start here. What was so interesting and intriguing about this film is, a lot of his films have a nod to the 70s, right? And there's no clearer nod to the 70s than the Grindhouse.
Yes.
I don't even call it a series of films, the double feature.
Yeah.
And what was really interesting about this particular film, Death Proof, is that it was matched up in initial runs with Planet Terror, which was, and so they were cut down. So when I first saw it, it was like an hour and a half. Then there was like an actual intermission at a film, which was so interesting. And then Planet Terror came on after. Now, again, the whole runtime of the whole thing was just over 3 hours. So when then they released them individually as films on DVD, then it was like the full version. So this one clocks in at 2 hours and 7 minutes. But do you remember any other film in the last 30 years doing anything quite like this?
No.
And that's what, to me, I really thought was interesting about this, because it was different. I doubt that there's anybody in the world who would put this in, say, their top even 5 of Tarantino movies, and I have it coming in at 6. Just before we move off of that, where did you have Kill Bill coming in?
I have Kill Bill at 3 actually for me, and then I think we also didn't rank Jackie Brown. I have it at 6.
Okay, so I have Jackie Brown at 5 and Kill Bill at 4.
Yeah.
So, but I love this movie for what it is. And interestingly enough, I was on another podcast about Tarantino, and I went back and watched it, and it's fun.
Yeah.
There are some great scenes. It wasn't his best by any stretch of the imagination. But that to me is what is so interesting about it, because it was unique.
Yeah.
The fact that when they first released it to the theaters, you could go and watch a double feature, and I was a big fan of, and still am, of Robert Rodriguez as well.
Yes.
So to be able to see that in the theater, I'll never forget it. And again, that was like I'm becoming this budding Tarantino like obsessed young man, and to get to see that, it's something I'll never forget.
Yeah.
And I was on the podcast with the guy that actually went to see that with, and we reminisced about that time.
That's
It was a
good.
lot of fun.
It's my least favorite of the Tarantinos, but still good.
I don't think that that's unusual.
Yeah.
I do have it coming in at number 7, but still definitely in the bottom third.
Yeah.
No discussion about budget here. And I'm wondering if that's because maybe the whole project was under a specific budget and it was impossible for them to know what the individual budgets were. Only 31 million worldwide gross on this one, which is very surprising. I will say that this was the most under the radar of his films. I don't think that they had a whole lot of I think they wanted to do it as a passion project.
Sure.
And I don't think that it's definitely not people's favorites, and it definitely didn't make the money at the box office.
No, but the people who love it, it's that cult following again. It's the people who go for exactly that kind of movie.
This one comes in at 7.0. So to date, on Tarantino films, the lowest.
Yes, that's fair to me.
As we get to Death Proof, 7.0, definitely lower than I thought that it would be. So it doesn't really even come in on IMDb's top films, but 7.0 is still nothing to scoff at.
Yeah, that's right.
Which brings us to the next film, was Inglourious Bastards, that came out in 2009. Glorious Bastards came in at an 8.3. Number 140 IMDb film of all time. Of course, this one did win an Oscar for Best Performance Supporting Actor for Christoph Waltz. So again, Tarantino's films are winning Oscars, and I believe Kill Bill won for visual effects.
Sure.
But still no love for Tarantino. Again, Tarantino was nominated for not only directing, but also screenplay. And he didn't win either one for this film.
Yeah. I know this is not your most favorite, but I love this movie. I think I fell in love with Brad Pitt all over again, because seeing his acting in this, there's so much depth in his acting, and he's so fantastic in it. His mispronunciations of especially Italian are hilarious in it. We do that at home all the time.
Which is so interesting, because I love Brad Pitt.
Yeah.
I wanted to like this movie. It just, for me, I have it all the way down at 9. It's one I need to give another watch to.
Yeah.
But again, not necessarily my genre. But I'm glad to know that you're so high on it. I think that's really cool.
Even my daughter, who doesn't really like violent movies, she'll pick this if it's one of our choices.
So this one, to date, had the highest budget at $70 million, with an opening weekend of $38 million back in 2009, and a gross U.S. and Canada take of $120 million. A gross worldwide of $323 million. So this one was obviously very successful for Tarantino. I've had a lot of people ask me what it was about this film that I didn't and don't care for. It's a genre thing.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, and I think we'll probably talk about it a little bit when we get into our next show about guilty pleasures. This is just not something that I have ever been drawn to in terms of I don't necessarily want to call this a war movie. I guess you could. It's definitely in that spirit, but it was just, I don't know if it was the subtitles. I saw it and I just didn't get into it.
Yeah.
And maybe I think with another watch, I think I could
with
probably do
the
it.
subtitles, because I'm older, we use closed captioning at our house now, and I can barely watch TV without it anymore. But it fit right in for me. And this is another one, the sly humor in this movie. Again, should we be laughing at a movie about the subject matter? But it's just so beautifully done. Christoph Waltz, what a genius. I just love him so much.
I love him in Django.
Yeah, I love him in Django too. I love him more in Django. But this was probably the first one of his movies that I'd ever seen, and I just could not get over the glee with which he played a horrible Nazi officer.
Yeah.
And how he gets it in the end is just fabulous, you know?
What's interesting to me about this film before we move off of it is this is the one that really set the stage for Once Upon a Time. He's actually come out and said that.
Yeah.
Because that's basically, this is like Once Upon a Time in history.
Yeah.
Obviously, this is historical fiction. You know, you're using characters that really existed,
Yeah.
but you're doing things with them that did not happen.
Exactly.
And I believe that if it wasn't for this movie, Once Upon a Time, or maybe would have never been envisioned by Tarantino. So I
Right.
guess at a minimum, I've got to at least give him credit in that vein.
You really do. And it's got a fabulous story to it. You know, it really does.
It's been so long since I've seen
Yeah,
it. I'm ashamed to say. Next up on the Tarantino lineage was 2012's Django Unchained. Comes in at an 8.4, number 179 in the best films on IMDb. So with some pretty high marks here. Inglourious Bastards at 140, Reservoir Dogs at 90, Pulp Fiction, of course, at 8, and then we come in at 179 here for Django. Django was very interesting to me. Again, coming off of a film that, frankly, I didn't particularly like all that much in Inglourious Bastards, a $100 million budget for Django Unchained. Shocking to me, when you think about it. Certainly the highest to date. 162 million gross U.S. and Canada, and a $426 million worldwide gross. So again, to date, his most successful film at the box office.
This is one that, you know, it would also probably make my guilty pleasure list, and it's very, very high on my list at number 2.
I have this one coming in at 6.
I feel guilty for liking it so much, but then I love the power that, you know, Jamie Foxx, you know, comes out of it with.
Another character who, yes, Jamie Foxx is more of a pop culture icon than an actor. Like when you think about some of his, now obviously he's had some great films in his day, but he's not much of a Hollywood actor. And this was such an odd, you know, before the film came out, I'm thinking Jamie Foxx is playing your lead.
Yeah.
And then of course, you know, when you see it, he's just masterful.
You just have this quiet power about him, or urged on by Christoph Waltz's character. Just, you know, for someone, you know, in a period film like that, to have the compassion and the love and the seeing so much potential in a human being, and elevating him to a level that he would never have seen during that time in history. And that's what I love. It's such an honor of, you know, of that kind of character.
And what's interesting here, Waltz actually won the Best Supporting Actor again, and Tarantino won Best Screenplay.
Yeah.
Still no love at Best Director, even for a film of this caliber. Here's a rare film that does amazingly box office, very, very highly regarded, and not in the mold of some of these summer blockbuster type films.
Yeah. Exactly. And you got to love Leonardo DiCaprio.
Of course, yes.
You got to love him. You just don't get to see him play a villain like that.
What's interesting about DiCaprio here is this is really at a major turning point in his life. I mean, prior to that, yes, The Departed in 2006, of course, Catch Me If You Can back in 2002. But it was here where you really started seeing him come into his own a dramatic actor, and not just playing the young, good-looking, you know, young man.
Yeah.
And that's what I think was interesting. I think Leonardo owes, I think a lot of these actors and actresses owe Tarantino a lot.
No doubt.
And I think that's why he got away for such a long period of time of not having huge budgets for these films and getting these A-list and maybe B-list stars.
Yeah.
But this is one that at 2 hours and 45 minutes, I think this might be the longest Tarantino film. It doesn't seem like it. It's a very fast-moving film. I think that there's so much elegance here. I think wonderful acting. Of course, like I said, you know, I love DiCaprio in this movie. And of course, you can't forget Samuel L. Jackson's also in this one.
Kerry Washington, I don't think anyone's ever gotten a better, more compelling performance from her either.
Very, very interesting
Oh, and
point.
Don Johnson.
Yes.
I mean, how much do you love him in this? He's horrible, but he's so good at it.
Absolutely. So for me, again, I have Django coming in at 6, but that's only because of how high I am on Jackie Brown.
Yeah.
And when I was on my previous podcast about this, that was sort of where part of the argument came in, is that I am so much higher on Jackie Brown for other reasons, mainly because of the Elmore Leonard connection. And that was really the first film that I saw as a Tarantino fan.
Yeah.
But I still love Django. I do think that there were some times that it was a little slow, but I think for the most part the pacing of the movie
and
was
it's
extremely well done.
The other thing you can't overlook is there's some stuff that's a little cringy in it too. It has redeeming qualities, but it still is just really upsetting to see some of it.
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
Next up is The Hateful Eight. This comes in at a 7.8 IMDb ranking and did, again, pick up another Oscar for Best Achievement in Music Written for Motion Pictures. Nominated cinematography and Jennifer Jason Leigh as supporting actress. Again, no love for Quentin Tarantino.
Yeah.
Now, I certainly wouldn't put The Hateful Eight up with almost any of these other films. In fact, I have it all the way down, no pun intended, at number 8. This was one that I didn't see in the theater. I did purchase it when it came out. I started watching it. It was the beginning of this movie is slow.
It is very slow.
I mean, until they get to the point where the action starts taking place, if you will, and very minimal action, mostly dialogue in this film. Beautifully shot.
Yes.
And so one of the things that I learned when I read the Quentin Tarantino book was, one of the biggest things that I give credit to both Nolan and Tarantino here are the fact that they are trying to preserve film, like actual film, and not engaging in the digital aspect of it, actually still using film.
Yeah.
And this movie was shot in a specific film type that they had to retrofit across the country, different cinemas, in order to be able to show this film in 8mm.
Wow.
And so that's something that is so unusual. And Nolan's stuck to his guns, too, about using actual film and sort of preserving the legacy of filmography.
Yeah.
And so if you watch this movie, first of all, hopefully you have a nice TV. And it's just beautifully done. But I am almost kicking myself now that I didn't have the opportunity to get to see that in the theater back in 2015. Other than being here at the college,
I saw it opening night.
Wow.
And like we've said, it isn't the best, but it has some pretty amazing features to it. And, Jennifer Jason Leigh, another resurrection of it wasn't a long-lived resurrection, but still, she got to show off her chops in a way she really hadn't before. And also, it introduced us to Walton Goggins, who is just silly and fun, but just so talented. And I love the character he played in that, too.
Yeah, so I did get back to watch this, and I did enjoy it. Even so, I certainly can't put it above Django, and I would say the one that I might have the most difficulty with is that or Death Proof.
Yeah.
I like Death Proof because of the sort of grindhouse double feature type thing. I thought it was super unique. But Hateful Eight, it's tough to have it all the way down there, and that doesn't mean I don't like it.
Yeah.
I would genuinely say at least my first impression of Inglourious Basterds was that I didn't particularly care for it. But I liked The Hateful Eight.
Yeah.
And so there are some redeeming qualities. So if there are any of these films that you haven't seen, we certainly advise that you take the time to check them out.
Exactly. They're better than 75% of what's out there, that's for sure.
90% of what's out there. All right, well, that brings us to our final film in the Quentin Tarantino universe that we're going to talk about today, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. This one comes in at, I'm actually shocked to see this, at a 7.6.
That's so wrong.
I am very, very surprised by that. Now, again, anything above a 7 is good.
Sure.
In fact, the top 250 movies, the 250th movie is at an 8.0. So you're talking about, in the sevens, I'm sure there's tons and tons and tons of movies at that. So it's hard to estimate where it would be. But it's still very, very highly regarded.
Yeah.
We were talking earlier about how frustrated I was that he did not win Best Director for this film.
Me too.
$90 million budget, $142 million in the U.S. and Canada, and $374 million worldwide. This was an absolute grand slam. Really showed his relevance because it had been 4 years. It seems like he's taken 3, 4, even 5 years off between films. This one I just love, and I have this in at number 3.
Yeah.
I've had some time to sort of digest this one because when I was on my previous podcast, it was about a year ago, and I did it probably February of last year, and I'd seen it. I hadn't seen it in the theater, but I'd watched it on DVD a couple of times, and now that I've gotten to see it even another time or two, this is one that I just absolutely love.
Oh my gosh, the chemistry between Brad Pitt and Leonardo DiCaprio, beautiful. And again, Brad Pitt at that time, socially, out in the pop culture world, his image was really suffering right then. And I'm telling you, I know it's acting, but he really redeemed himself with me. The sensitivity of that he played with that character. And then I was a child that was fascinated with Helter Skelter and the Mansons. So, yeah, the ranch scenes, definitely you could see how creepy that was. Mm-hmm. I loved the joy that they portrayed Sharon Tate as having, that she went and saw herself in a movie and could not stop smiling and just being such a happy, happy person. You'd love to imagine that's the way she was. And the retelling of that, they did it I felt actually a sensitive way, because that's a horrible event in our history. And tell that story in that way, I loved it. That retelling was fascinating.
You're talking about Sharon Tate here. A lot of people thought Margot Robbie's part in this film was well underplayed, that a lot of what she was doing was just kind of dancing and dressing provocatively.
I didn't see it that way.
A lot of people really, maybe some negative comments that I heard about this movie in particular were that they didn't give her enough in the script and that it was sort of a male-dominated, which is so weird because we go back to Pulp Fiction, we go back to Jackie Brown, we go back to Kill Bill, and now years later, he's getting sort of the opposite critique of, a perspective that, you're just making her be pretty, and that's all that she means to this film. I agree with you. I didn't take that away either.
Oh, I thought she should have won something for it because it was just beautiful. And like I said again, the chemistry between the two, leading actors, it was just beautiful. And seeing Leonardo so vulnerable, like so worried about his lack of talent. That scene with the little girl, I die over that every time. I just love it so much.
And that's the one of all of them that you remember, other than of course the flamethrower at the end.
Yeah. Oh.
But so interestingly enough, Leslie, winning for Brad Pitt. Okay, he wins an Oscar. Winning for Best Achievement in Production Design. So again, they had to retrofit all of those businesses to have a 70s facade.
Yeah.
And so that's probably where a lot of that budget went. So I absolutely get that. But here you go. Quentin Tarantino, Best Original Screenplay, Best Director, doesn't win. It's just sad to me that someone of his ilk, and we're constantly naming, every single one of these films, Leslie, is a 7.0 and up.
Yeah.
Never to have won.
Well, my son, who's a cinemaphile, he gets mad around Oscar time because so many movies are kind of, he calls them Oscar bait, a certain kind of movie, a certain kind of tug at your heartstrings kind of thing. Now, I think of them as elevated from that, but I get what he's saying. That's particularly to me why Tarantino's been overlooked so much. He's just a solid, fantastic director. Now, like a Lifetime Achievement Award, he's a shoo-in for. But do we really care about that?
Such a cop-out.
Yeah, exactly.
So, well, I must say I had Once Upon a Time all the way up at number 3.
I have it at 4, and I'm still fluctuating on that.
Well, I'm just going to quickly read down my top films. I started off at number 1, Reservoir Dogs, Pulp Fiction. I had Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, Kill Bill, Jackie Brown, Django Unchained, Death Proof, Hateful Eight, and Inglourious Bastards. How about you?
I've got number 1 is Pulp Fiction, 2 Django, 3 Kill Bill, 4 Once Upon a Time, 5 Inglourious Bastards, 6 Jackie Brown, Hateful Eight at 7, Reservoir Dogs 8, and Death Proof at 9.
Gosh, that just breaks my heart where you have Reservoir Dogs. Django Unchained at number 2.
Yeah.
Shocking.
I can't not watch that movie when it's on. But the thing is, ask me tomorrow what I think, and it probably is going to move around. I can't help it.
I got to tell you that I think I'm pretty close to where I was about a year ago, but I totally agree with you.
Yeah.
Leslie, I will admit that we've gone on a little bit longer than typical, but I just want to say one more thing here about Tarantino. When we were doing our pre-show meeting today, of course, I brought up Tarantino's IMDb page to, have a frame of reference for a lot of this stuff. Well, Django Zorro is in pre-production. So a sequel-ish, if you will, I suppose, to Django Unchained to where he meets Zorro. There is a log line on there. I encourage you to check that out. And then something that was announced, before we move off of that, Django Zorro with a 2022 release date at this point, more than likely latter part of 2022 if they're just in pre-production right now. 2022 seems aggressive if they haven't started filming. But also, I did not know this, so maybe this might be news to all you Tarantino fans out there. Kill Bill Volume 3 has been announced. There's no release date yet, and if they're not even in pre-production yet, that means that there's probably a lot of things that are still being worked out. But odd that I think this is the first time that I ever recall that 2 films that he might be working on simultaneously.
Wow, yeah.
Now, just because it's been announced doesn't really mean much. Pre-production is really what you want to see. I wonder if maybe Kill Bill Volume 3 starts, really ramping up in 2023.
Yeah.
So we had some indication that Tarantino was going to hang it up after one more film because he's done 9 and 10. Number 10 would be whatever his next film is. And there's been a lot of talk that he was going to hang it up after his next film. And I'd even heard rumors that his final film would be like a Star Trek type of film. I no longer see that on his IMDb page, which is fine with me. I'm sure some people would be interested in seeing something like that. Not me. But I'm so happy to know that both we get another sort of incarnation of Django and then Kill Bill Volume 3 very near future.
Awesome. Yeah.
So, Tarantino definitely had an interesting career, definitely learned some things here today just chatting with you about some of these individual films. So sad that he hasn't taken home an Oscar yet to this point for direction. Of course, he does own an Oscar for the writing in Pulp Fiction. But even so, only one Oscar is pretty incredible. But any final thoughts?
Just that this body of work, if our listeners haven't delved into it, they got to get busy because this will change your life. It really will.
And I think, to me personally, especially if you've never seen some of these films, I would honestly just go in an alphabetical order.
Sure, absolutely.
Not alphabetical order, a chronological
any order, really, but chronological would be a great build-up.
And I think that it's really interesting in terms of how the films change over time.
Yes.
And I think that would be a unique way to knock some of these films
Yes,
off.
Absolutely.
I'm doubting you're listening to it if you haven't seen any of them. But I'm
That's
sure,
right.
And like I said, even for me, even as a huge fan, there are certain films that I just didn't get that kind of draw to. So
I need to revisit some. I just know that from now.
Well, Leslie, I really appreciate your time today. It was definitely a chock full episode.
So much fun.
But always a pleasure to be on here nights at the movies with you.
Yes, I love it too. Thanks for having me.
All right, well, that's going to do it for this episode of Nights at the Movies with Paul Miller and Leslie Heimbaugh. All right, we'll see you again next month.